My name's Michelle Herzog, and I'm the History Social Science Consultant here at the Los Angeles County Office of Education. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special webcast about California's Fair Education Act. The Fair Education Act is an important piece of legislation in California, and as its name implies, the law aims to add a sense of fairness into our public school instruction, especially with regard to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons. When Governor Brown signed the Fair Education Act into law in 2011, it was met with considerable controversy. Today, many school administrators are finding that the controversy is still alive as teachers try to follow the law. What's the nature of the controversy? What does the Fair Education Act actually say? Are there helpful guidelines for implementing the Fair Education Act in public schools? I've invited a special guest to help us answer these questions. My guest today is Damon Huss. He's the Senior Editor and Curriculum Specialist at Constitutional Rights Foundation in Los Angeles. He's also a lawyer and former middle school social studies teacher. And in his capacity at CRF, Damon also serves as the director of the California 3 R's Project for Rights, Responsibility, and Respect in matters of teaching about religion in public schools. So thank you, Damon, for joining me today.
Thank you, Michelle, for inviting me and including me in this webcast. I should also state for the record that nothing I say in this webcast should be construed as legal advice to anyone. I will be speaking generally about what the Fair Education Act says about social studies education. If viewers have any specific legal questions, they should refer those to their school district's Office of Legal Counsel.
That's good advice. Thanks for clarifying that, Damon. Before we go any further, though, tell us a little bit more about the California 3 R's, where it comes from, and what a valuable resource it is for schools.
Sure. As you mentioned, the California 3 R's project is for rights, responsibility, and respect in matters of teaching about religion in public schools. And that's pretty much what it is. The California 3 R's project has been around for over 20 years. Dr. Margaret Hill, Peg Hill from California State University San Bernardino was the director for many years. And now she's a co-director with me as the project came to CRF about 4.5 years ago. And the 3 R's is really a network in California that helps school administrators and especially teachers know the parameters of the First Amendment when teaching about religion and also freedom of conscience in public schools. Because as you know, there's lots of case law about the teaching of religion and freedom of conscience issues in public schools. And some of it can be very confusing for teachers and administrators, so the 3 R's tries to help them understand what those parameters are.
Great. It's a great resource because these sensitivities come up in a lot of areas. So I'm glad you're leading the work and that this is part of the conversation.
Thank you.
So let's get back to our conversation about the Fair Act. Damon, if you can give us some background on that. What is the Fair Education Act? What was its purpose?
As you said earlier, Michelle, the Fair Education Act, or FAIR Act for short, is intended to offer fairness in the treatment of different groups, including LGBT people, in social studies instruction. It began as Senate Bill 48, or SB 48, in response to multiple cases of gay or transgender students being bullied and abused in schools. SB 48 followed soon after the tragic case in Oxnard of Seth Walsh, a boy who came out as gay in middle school but experienced repeated and severe anti-gay bullying. In 2010, Seth committed suicide. California lawmakers responded to this case and many others with the Fair Education Act. Sponsors of the act cited research that shows that inclusion of LGBT people in instruction lowers the impetus some students might have for bullying and increases student safety on campus. In essence, the FAIR Act requires that history and social studies instruction and instructional materials in the state be fair, accurate, inclusive, and respectful to LGBT people and persons with disabilities, as well as several other groups. The FAIR Act had a few general provisions. The first was to amend the Education Code to require public schools to teach about political, economic, and social contributions of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons, among others, in California and the nation. With regard to the contributions of various groups, amendments to the language are indicated on this slide by underlined words. For example, cultural groups were included as well as ethnic groups. Also note that the last clause here in the revised section states that there should be particular emphasis on portraying the role of these groups in contemporary society. Anti-discrimination language was also added to the Ed Code. The anti-discrimination provisions are summarized here. Sexual orientation was added to the Ed Code's anti-discrimination language, along with race, ethnicity, religion, and so on. The sections, as you see here, focused on teachers' instruction and district-sponsored activities in Section 51500 and textbook adoption and the use of instructional materials in Section 51501. And I will add that the Act required that the Ed Code would remind charter schools and alternative schools that they too are prohibited from engaging in discrimination.
Thank you, Damon, for laying out some of the provisions. That's very important language for us to understand. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the controversies surrounding the FAIR Act.
The controversy has been almost exclusively tied to the inclusion of LGBT people in the law. As soon as Governor Brown signed the bill, some groups opposing the law tried to get petition signatures for ballot initiatives to remove the FAIR Act from the books, specifically the provisions about sexual orientation. Those initiative efforts failed. From my own reading and discussions with teachers, administrators, and district personnel, it seems many who oppose the law think that the FAIR Act mandates teaching about the morality of same-sex relationships. But you'll recall that the provisions simply state that the historic and contemporary contributions of LGBT people and accompanying anti-discrimination language are added to the Ed Code. There is nothing in the law mandating that teachers make value judgments of any kind about anyone's sexual orientation.
So I know that administrators and district supervisors are speaking with parents who are very concerned that the FAIR Act is designed for their children to be indoctrinated into alternative lifestyles. What does the law say or imply about this issue?
Indoctrination is not part of the law's rationale or language at all. State Senator Mark Leno, who co-sponsored the SB 48 bill back in 2011, argued that the law was needed not just to help the self-esteem of LGBT students. He also said that it would benefit straight students who will learn that the LGBT students in class with them are part of a community that is fighting for its civil rights. Students would not, however, learn, and textbooks and other instructional materials would not reflect, that it is somehow better to be homosexual or bisexual than to be heterosexual, or vice versa. That would not only be pedagogically inappropriate, but moreover, it would be legally prohibited. The anti-discrimination language in the law is clear about that. Let's look at this more closely. The anti-discrimination language, as you see here, states that any matter that reflects adversely upon persons because of their race or ethnicity, gender, religion, disability, nationality, or sexual orientation is prohibited. That means all teaching and materials cannot reflect adversely upon persons for their sexual orientation, whether heterosexuality or homosexuality.
So that's an important piece to remember. Part of the intent here is to kind of reduce the bullying that's occurring in schools, specifically targeted to LGBT community. So glad you could point that out for us.
Yeah, that's very important, and we'll come back and talk about that too, I think. The law also prohibits discrimination based on any characteristic listed in Section 220 of the Education Code, which includes gender identity and gender expression too. I should add that no teacher or administrator is required to change their own opinions about sexual orientation. They just can't share those opinions with students where those opinions reflect adversely on anyone based on sexual orientation. Local education authorities at the administrative and classroom levels are now only required to include, where appropriate, the contributions of LGBT persons, and to refrain from using discriminatory language about sexual orientation.
So some administrators still have concerns that teachers may not have the right tools or resources to teach content in accordance with the FAIR Act. What are some guidelines that exist for teachers?
First, you will recall that one of the FAIR Act's main provisions was that governing boards adopt instructional materials that accurately reflect the diversity of our society. The state's textbook adoptions, therefore, involve a process of review to make sure that textbooks and any digital instructional materials do not contain discriminatory language, but also that they contain materials about the contributions of LGBT people that are age and grade level appropriate for students.
So I think you're right, Damon. Instruction must always be evidence-based, and I'm glad you brought up the issue of the framework, which contains a number of content guidelines for social studies teachers throughout the state. The California Department of Education and State Board of Education adopted a revised framework in 2016, and it reflects the Fair Education Act's provisions, so that will be a great resource. What are some examples of how the new framework for history social science treats FAIR Act-aligned material?
A coalition of LGBT advocacy groups petitioned for 97 revisions to the framework that would execute the FAIR Act's provisions in a practical way. 48 revisions of the original 97 were included in the framework. An excellent example comes from the second grade content in the framework. Here, students learn historical thinking, that is, age and grade level appropriate, by looking at their own families in the context of the question, how do families remember their past? As you can see, the language of the framework includes many different kinds of families that exist in our society. Immigrant families, families with lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender parents, blended families, families headed by single parents, extended families, and so on. This makes the curriculum inclusive so that students who do not come from traditional nuclear families with two opposite-sex parents don't feel excluded or like second-class citizens.
So I think with young children, this is raising other sensitivities among parents and families, and I think it would be wise for districts and local schools and districts to use their own discretion when it comes to addressing this, particularly with young children. Would you agree?
Oh, I definitely agree. And the framework is a content guidance for teachers and for schools to use. But I think what you said is very important for them to keep in mind for their local communities.
Do you have any other examples you can share with us today?
Sure. From the framework, in the fourth grade, which focuses on California history, students learn about people who came to California and then shaped the environment of California. Students learn about notable people like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who came here and contributed greatly to the civil rights history of California. And in the context of civil rights, they also learn about Harvey Milk, who happened to be California's first openly gay public official. Again, this is age and grade level appropriate. In high school, students learn about the roles of important people in the civil rights movement. They learn about the black churches and women such as Fannie Lou Hamer and Rosa Parks. In that context of civil rights, students also learn about Bayard Rustin, who was a principal organizer of the 1963 March on Washington and who happened to be a gay man. This fits with the FAIR Act's provision that the political contributions of LGBT people will be included.
So the information lays out pretty clear what the Fair Education Act says and how schools and teachers can implement it. Thank you. You did a very nice job of clarifying that. But administrators may still have to engage with members of their school communities who are still unsure or hesitant to embrace the Fair Education Act or the intent of it. What would you suggest to administrators from a practical perspective that'll help those skeptics better understand the intent and language of the provisions?
I can appreciate that, Michelle. For hesitant teachers, I would point out that it is the law that anti-gay and anti-LGBT discrimination are prohibited. Such discrimination is as illegal as discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and ethnicity. That's just a fact of being a public school teacher. But I would also say that Anti-bullying is the key. For skeptical or hesitant parents in the community, as well as teachers, I would suggest that none of us want to live in a society that condones or turns a blind eye to bullying. As members of a democratic society, and regardless of our personal convictions or opinions about sexual orientation, all of us want a society of confident equals where no one is bullied or abused. I would emphasize that the FAIR Act is a buffer against bullying, and I would appeal to any skeptic's sense of fairness that way.
Simply put, we have seen this kind of conversation emerge in the past when other underrepresented groups felt the need to urge the contributions, the recognition of contributions of a variety of groups. It's affirming to members of those groups. It's part of a well-rounded view of history in a diverse society. So I think of that in the same context of that. I think you'd agree with that.
Absolutely. It's all part of a continuum of civil rights and a long historical struggle.
And the focus on the anti-bullying is key too, I think. So that's an important element to remember.
Yes, absolutely.
And I've heard from a lot from experts too that as schools enter into this, it's very useful for them to be kind of proactive in their approach. Have them sit down with grade level teachers to discuss and review the provisions, what it means, what it doesn't mean, just as you've clarified. Maybe have community meetings. Maybe send letters in advance to parents and families. Be proactive. Bring those groups together to have those conversations up front, because we all know it's easier to do that, front load that, than to have to respond to some issue that arises that people aren't prepared for. So fortunately, we have a number of resources available. The California Department of Education will have some. The California 3Rs project that you mentioned will have resources listed. There are some organizations that have some marvelous curriculum coming out, Constitutional Rights Foundation, Facing History and Ourselves. On the page where this is broadcast, this webcast, will have a list of other resources. I understand State PTA has some things that are helpful to schools as well. So yeah, we urge people to access some of that to be in compliance with the new law. Damon, I really want to thank you for joining us today, for really providing your expertise and clarification. I know it's going to be very useful to school administrators across the state. And we urge administrators to look at our other webcast in production. It's targeted for teachers. So together, those two I think will be very helpful. And thank you for joining me today and helping with this.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here, Michelle. I really appreciate it.
I also want to take a moment to thank our wonderful production crew here, led by Tyler Cook, and our producer for today, Mike McMahon. Thank you for dedicating your resources to making this resource available for schools. I also need to thank my division director of the Division of Curriculum and Instructional Services, Dr. Yvonne Contreras, our assistant director, Danielle Mitchell, and of course our great LACOE superintendent, Dr. Deborah Eduardo, for supporting this work and providing the space for us to share this information with schools. And to our viewers, I want to thank you for taking the time for viewing this webcast and giving attention to this very important topic that is so deserving. We all want our schools to be places where all students can come and learn and be safe. So I thank you for making that commitment to make that a reality.